African Americans struggled perhaps more than any group during the Great Depression. The drop in farm prices severely affected Black Americans, who farmed in the South. Southern blacks left sharecropping behind and moved to southern cities. Southern whites demanded that all jobs be given to whites over blacks, and by 1932, over 50% of African Americans in the South were unemployed. 400,000 blacks left the South altogether, moving to northern cities in search of work. Racism and discrimination continued in the South unchecked during the Depression. The most famous example was the Scottsboro case. On March 25, 1931, 9 African American teenagers were accused of raping 2 white women aboard a Southern Railroad freight train in northern Alabama. They were searching for work when a racially charged fight broke out between passengers. The young white men who were fighting were forced to exit the train. Enraged, they made up a story of how the black men caused the incident. By the time the train reached Paint Rock, Alabama, the Scottsboro Boys were met with an angry mob and charged with assault. Victoria Price and Ruby Bates, 2 white women, were also riding the freight train, faced charges of vagrancy and illegal sexual activity. In order to avoid these charges, they falsely accused the Scottsboro Boys of rape. The original cases were tried in Scottsboro, Alabama. Only 4 of the young African American men knew each other prior to the incident on the freight train, but as the trials drew increasingly regional and national attention, they became known as the Scottsboro Boys. On April 9, 1931, 8 of the 9 young men were convicted and sentenced to death. The judge granted Roy Wright, the youngest of the group, a mistrial because of age, despite the recommendation of the all-white jury. After this initial verdict, protests emerged in the North, leading to the U.S. Supreme Court overturning the convictions in 1932. The Supreme Court demanded a retrial on the grounds that the young men did not have adequate legal representation. A series of retrials and reconvictions followed, and the Scottsboro Boys collectively served more than 100 years in prison. Subsequently, the national conversation and protests of unfair and unequal court proceedings led to 2 additional groundbreaking Supreme Court decisions on 1935 on jury diversification. Mexican migration into the U.S. had steadily increased throughout the 1910s and 1920s, mainly due to the increased need for laborers. This need was caused by the sharp decline in Chinese and Japanese laborers as a result of the Chinese Exclusion Act and the Gentlemen's Agreement. Mexican immigrants were also pushed to the U.S. by the Mexican Revolution of 1917. By the early 1930s, over 2 million Mexicans and Mexican Americans lived in the U.S., filling mainly low-level work in the West and Southwest. Many were agricultural workers, but some also lived in urban areas around the country. As the Depression worsened, whites began to demand the jobs held by these immigrants. The U.S. government responded by imposing restrictions for immigrant labor, prohibiting companies from hiring immigrants. Many employers fired their Mexican employees, and most refused to hire Mexican workers. In total, between 400,000 and 1.8 million Mexicans left the U.S. between 1929 and 1937. Between 60% and 80% of the people that were either deported or left voluntarily were American citizens. The Great Depression seemed to strengthen the idea that the woman's place was in the home. A majority of Americans believed that men should have access to open jobs because they need to provide for their family. In fact, it was a commonly held belief that married women should not take a job if their husband was employed. Despite this, many married and single women worked throughout the Great Depression. As you can see in the chart, women as a percentage of the workforce jumped from 18% to 29%. The number of married women worked jumped drastically as well, prompting many single women to protest, as you can see in the photo. This number increased throughout the Depression, despite numerous obstacles. Jobs more commonly held by women, like teaching and social work, were being filled by men over women. Female industrial workers were laid off. Black women suffered greatly due to the tremendous drop in domestic service jobs available. Radio, which had become very popular in the 1920s, was a cheaper alternative to movies. Families spent hours in front of the radio listening to their favorite programs. They offered excellent dramas and variety programs. Orson Welles, an actor, director, producer, and writer, created one of the most renowned radio broadcasts of all time, called War of the Worlds, on October 30, 1938. This broadcast caused a panic across America. At the point in the radio broadcast where the Martians were invading towns on the countryside, a power outage occurred in the tiny town of Concrete, Washington. People ran to the hills for cover. It was, of course, proved to be a hoax. In fact, 3 times during the broadcast, they announced that it was just a show. The broadcast caused a panic among listeners because people were accustomed to getting their news by the radio, and it seemed like a real news broadcast. FDR also used fireside chats over the radio to explain in clear, simple language his New Deal measures. These informal talks made Americans feel as if FDR was talking directly to them. America needed an escape from the hard times of the Great Depression. Movies provided an outlet for them. Movies like Gone with the Wind did just that. It was a sweeping drama about life among Southern plantation owners during the Civil War. Adjusted for inflation, it is the highest grossing movie of all time. It has made equal to $1.8 billion adjusted for inflation. It is currently ranked 4th on AFI's Top 100 Movies list. Walt Disney scored a major hit with his first feature-length animated film, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. It's ranked 49th on AFI's Top 100 Movies list. Adjusted for inflation, Snow White would be number 10 all-time in box office revenue at $982 million. It has been released in theaters 4 separate times. Another popular film released during the Great Depression was King Kong in 1933. This monster adventure romance was released to rave reviews and is considered one of the top 5 horror movies of all time. Although the special effects don't hold up to today's standards, it has been re-released 5 times and remade several times, and its story still holds up today. It's currently ranked number 41 on AFI's Top 100 Movies list. Finally, a film that still captures the hearts of Americans today is The Wizard of Oz. This magical film was released in 1939 and is widely regarded as one of the greatest films of all time. It was based on the Frank Baum novel and is best known for its introduction of color to the big screen. It received numerous Academy Award nominations and won for Best Original Score and Best Original Song. It is currently ranked 9th on AFI's Top 100 Movie list. President Hoover, like most of his predecessors, did not believe the federal government should get involved in the economy. This is known as laissez-faire. Hoover's defining belief was called rugged individualism. He believed that each American is responsible for his own welfare. He had famously said numerous times, "Only through personal effort can wealth and success be achieved." Hoover also opposed direct relief. He subscribed to the concept known as volunteerism. He, like many conservatives, thought relief should come from the family, churches, charities, state, or local government. Hoover also held the belief that depressions are a normal part of the business cycle, and that in time, the depression will end and the economy would recover. Hoover also gathered business, banking, and labor leaders together and asked them to work together to find solutions to our economic woes. Eventually, he decided to act. He convinced Congress to pass the Federal Home Loan Bank Act, which lowered mortgage rates for homeowners and allowed farmers to refinance their farm loans and avoid foreclosure. Congress also passed the Reconstruction Finance Corporation. It authorized up to $2 billion for emergency financing for banks, life insurance companies, railroads, and other large businesses. Hoover believed that money would trickle down to the average citizen through job growth and higher wages. The RFC proved to be a failure, as large businesses kept the money to avoid closures. In 1924, Congress rewarded veterans of World War I with certificates, redeemable in 1945 for $1,000 each. By 1932, many of these former servicemen had lost their jobs and fortunes in the early days of the Depression. They asked Congress to redeem their bonus certificates early. Led by Walter Waters of Oregon, the so-called Bonus Army set out for the nation's capital. Hitching rides, hopping trains, and hiking finally brought the Bonus Army, now 15,000 strong, into the Capitol in June of 1932. Although President Hoover refused to address them, the veterans did find an audience with the congressional delegation. Soon a debate began in Congress whether to meet the demonstrators' demands. As deliberation continued on Capitol Hill, the Bonus Army built a shantytown across the Potomac River in Anacostia Flats. When the Senate rejected their demands on June 17th, most of the veterans returned home, but several thousand remained in the Capitol with their families. Many had nowhere else to go. The Bonus Army conducted itself with decorum and spent their vigil unharmed. However, many believed them to be a threat to national security. On July 28th, Washington police began to clear the demonstrators out of the Capitol. 2 men were killed as tear gas and bayonets assailed the Bonus marchers. Fearing rising disorder, Hoover ordered an Army regiment into the city under the leadership of General Douglas MacArthur. The Army, complete with infantry, cavalry, and tanks, rolled into Anacostia Flats, forcing the Bonus Army to flee. MacArthur then ordered the shanty settlements burned. Many Americans were outraged. How could they treat the veterans of the Great War with such disrespect? Hoover maintained that political agitators, anarchists, and communists dominated the mob, but facts contradict his claims. 9 out of 10 bonus marchers were indeed veterans, and 20% were disabled. Despite the fact that the Bonus Army was the largest march on Washington up to that point in history, Hoover and MacArthur clearly overestimated the threat posed to national security. As Hoover campaigned for re-election that summer, his actions turned an already sour public opinion of him even further.